I knew something had shifted the moment my daughter-in-law walked past me in the hallway without saying a word. Not a good morning, not a nod. She had a coffee mug in one hand and her phone in the other, and she moved through my house, the house I had lived in for 31 years, like I was a piece of furniture that hadn't been worth moving yet. That was a Tuesday in October. The maple out front had just started turning. That deep burnt orange I used to love. I remember standing at the kitchen window watching the leaves come down and thinking, something is different now. Something has been different for a while, and I've been pretending I don't notice. My name is Sylvia. I'm 68 years old. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the youngest of four, raised by a mother who believed you kept your problems to yourself and your house clean enough for company. I carried that with me most of my life. Keep quiet. Be gracious. Don't make things difficult. I worked as a school librarian for 26 years. When my husband passed, this was 11 years ago now, a heart attack in March, very sudden, I kept working because the work kept me upright. We had one son. His name is Nathan. He was 32 when his father died, already married to a woman named Fiona. And I told myself I was lucky to have them close. Nathan worked in project management for a construction firm in Barrie. Fiona had worked in marketing before she stopped, which she said was to raise the children, though I noticed she had more time for things like spa appointments and weekend trips to Toronto than most working mothers I'd known. They had 2 children. My granddaughter, Lily, was 11 that October, and my grandson was 7. Lily was the quiet one, observant in the way children sometimes are when the adults around them aren't paying attention. I want to be honest about the beginning because it matters. When Nathan and Fiona first started struggling financially, this was about 4 years after Gerald passed, I didn't hesitate. Nathan called me on a Sunday evening and said they'd had an unexpected expense. Could I help with the HELOC payment that month? I said, of course. That's what you do. You help your child. The first time was $1,400. I didn't keep a record. I should have. My sister Patricia, who lives in Winnipeg and has always been more practical than me, told me to write things down. Sylvia, she said, memory is not the same as documentation. I laughed and said she was being dramatic. I was wrong. Over the next 2 years, the amounts varied. Sometimes it was the hydro bill. Once it was car insurance because they'd let it lapse, I found out later, for 3 months. There was a period when I was covering their grocery runs. Not all of them, but 100 here, 150 there, each transferred with a note that said, "Love you," because I didn't know how else to frame it. Nathan always had a reason. There was the period when the firm he worked for had delayed payroll. There was the time Fiona's car needed a transmission. There was the roof on their house in Innisfil, which I helped with because I didn't want my grandchildren living under a leak. What I didn't understand, what I was slow to understand, was that the money had stopped being help and had become a budget line. They were counting on it. I don't say this bitterly. Or maybe I do, a little. But I say it because it's true, and because I think a lot of women my age will recognize what I'm describing. It doesn't happen all at once. Nobody sits you down and says, "We've decided to live beyond our means and we'd like you to make up the difference." It happens in small gestures, in a tone of voice, in the way a request stops being a request and starts sounding like a reminder. The autumn I'm telling you about, I had been a widow for 9 years. I had my pension, a modest one from the school board, and I had the house, which was paid off. I had some savings in a TFSA and some GICs that I'd been careful with. I wasn't wealthy, but I was stable, and I had worked for that stability, and it was mine. That October, I had a routine appointment with my doctor, a check-in I'd been going to every 3 months since my blood pressure diagnosis. On the way home, I stopped at Tim Hortons and sat in the parking lot with a medium double-double and thought about the fact that I had $3,200 left in my checking account and that Nathan had mentioned, casually, the week before, that their property taxes were coming due. He hadn't asked. Not yet, but I knew the shape of the conversation. I had heard it enough times to recognize its approach. That evening, I drove to Nathan's house for dinner. It was a Sunday. We had been doing Sunday dinners, or trying to. I brought a loaf of bread I'd baked myself, a habit from when Nathan was small, and a bottle of Pinot Gris I'd picked up at the LCBO. When I got there, the kitchen smelled wonderful. Fiona had made something with rosemary and garlic, and I felt my shoulders drop a little, the way you do when you walk into warmth from cold. Lily ran to hug me. Her brother crashed into my legs right behind her. That part was still good. That part was always still good. That part was always still good. We sat down for dinner. Nathan carved a pork tenderloin at the counter and brought it to the table on a wooden board. There were roasted potatoes and green beans with almonds, and the bread I brought sliced in the middle of the table. I had taken one piece of bread and was reaching for the pork when Fiona said, not unkindly, not meanly, just matter-of-factly, "Oh, Sylvia, I made a plate for you in the fridge. I wasn't sure if you were coming." I looked at the table. The children had pork. Nathan had pork. Fiona had pork. "I'm here," I said. "I know," she said, smiling, "but I'd already plated yours. It's in the fridge. There's plenty." I want to be precise about this because it matters more than it sounds. It wasn't that she was cruel about it. It wasn't a dramatic moment. She said it the same way you'd tell someone you'd saved them a seat, but the plate in the fridge was from the previous week's leftovers. I recognized the container. I had brought that food myself 2 Sundays before. I sat at that table, and I ate the bread I had baked, and I watched my son cut his pork tenderloin, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that I had become optional in my own family. Not unwelcome. Optional. The kind of guest whose absence wouldn't change the meal. After dinner, when Nathan was putting the children to bed, Fiona sat across from me at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and talked pleasantly about a weekend they were planning in Muskoka. A cottage rental, she said. Not cheap, but they needed the break. She mentioned the name of the place. It was on one of the lakes Nathan and I used to fish on when he was a boy. Then she said, "I've been meaning to ask, do you have any flex in your schedule next month? We might need a hand with the kids while we're gone." She didn't say, "Will you pay for the cottage?" She didn't say anything about money that evening, but 2 days later Nathan called and mentioned, very briefly, as though it were already settled, that the property tax bill had come in at $6,800 and that it would really help if I could cover it this cycle. I said I needed to think about it. There was a pause on the phone. Not long, but present. "Of course," he said. After I hung up, I sat in my living room, the room where Gerald and I had spent 30 years of evenings, where the bookshelves still had his books on them, where the dog we'd had when Nathan was a teenager used to sleep by the radiator, and I let myself feel the thing I had been not feeling for 2 years. I felt used, not loved, and also used, just used, and I felt ashamed for feeling that way, which made it worse. I called my sister Patricia. She listened without interrupting, which is something she's always been good at. When I finished, she said, "Sylvia, you're not being dramatic, you're being accurate." She asked me one question. She said, "If you said no, not this time, just no, what do you think would happen?" I realized I didn't know, and that not knowing was its own kind of answer. The following week, I had Lily over for the afternoon, just the 2 of us. She was in grade 6, serious, liked reading and baking. We made butter tarts, which she'd been asking about, and she sat on the counter and talked the way children do when they feel safe, circling around things, then landing on them. "Grandma," she said, rolling the dough, "do you like coming to our house?" I looked at her. "I love seeing you," I said, which was true. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom talks on the phone a lot after you leave." I didn't ask her what she meant. She was 11 and I wasn't going to put her in that position. But I thought about it that night and the next night, and I started, for the first time, to look clearly at the shape of things. I went through my bank statements the last 18 months. I used a yellow legal pad and wrote down every transfer, every check, every amount I had given or lent without any conversation about repayment. When I reached the end of the page, I added it up twice because I didn't believe the first number, $41,200. In 18 months, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I made tea. Then I sat some more. I am not a dramatic person. I don't make scenes. I was raised not to. But that evening, I thought about my husband, about the years we had worked and saved and made careful choices, about the pension I stretched to make last, about the GICs I'd set aside for emergencies. And I thought about the pork tenderloin on the table and the leftovers in the fridge, and Fiona's pleasant voice saying I'd already plated yours, and something inside me that had been bending for a very long time quietly stopped. I didn't call Nathan. Not that night. Instead, I called my financial advisor, a woman named Renata at the credit union branch in town, whom I had worked with for years. I asked for an appointment the next morning. She had a cancellation. I was there at 9. I brought everything. My TFSA statements, the GIC details, the pension summary, the house appraisal I had done 2 years ago. Renata is careful and methodical, and she does not minimize things. I laid it all out, and I told her what I'd been doing, and she listened without expression, which is its own kind of kindness. When I finished, she said, "What would you like to do?" I told her I wanted to restructure everything. I wanted my finances protected in a way that was transparent to me and opaque to anyone else. I wanted the name removed from the joint account that Nathan and I had shared since Gerald's estate was settled, an account I had barely thought about in years but which, I realized now, Nathan had access to. "That's straightforward," Renata said. "We can do that today." We spent 2 hours together. I closed the joint account and moved the funds. I consolidated 2 GICs that were coming up for renewal into a new term. I set up a separate account, access to me only, with a different institution entirely. I reviewed the beneficiary designations on everything, the RRSP, the TFSA, the life insurance policy I still carried from when the children were small. When I walked out of that branch, it was just past 11 in the morning, and the sky was the particular pale gray of a Canadian November, and I stood on the sidewalk and breathed. I felt not victorious. I felt solid, like I had put my feet back under me. I drove home and called a lawyer. I had worked with a family lawyer years ago for Gerald's estate, but I wanted someone fresh. I found a woman through a referral from a colleague's widow who had been through something similar. Her office was in a strip mall, which I found reassuring. No pretension. I had a consultation the following week. I told her the situation plainly. She asked a few questions, took notes, and told me she could update my will within a month. I had been meaning to update it for years. It still reflected a reality that no longer existed. "What would you like it to reflect?" she asked. I told her. I thought about Lily. I thought about Nathan, and about the person he had been before Fiona, or before the version of himself he'd become with Fiona, because I don't know anymore where one ends and the other begins. I thought about what I wanted my life to mean and what I wanted my choices to say. I decided to leave the house to a land trust with a life interest for myself. I left the bulk of the liquid assets to my 2 grandchildren in trust, accessible when they reached 25. I left Nathan a meaningful amount, but not what he would have expected. And I wrote, very clearly, with the lawyer's help, a letter of wishes to accompany the will, which is not legally binding, but which would make the reasoning plain. The letter was 3 paragraphs. I did not name Fiona. I did not accuse anyone. I simply said that I had spent the last years of my life feeling unseen and financially exploited, and that the choices I had made were not made in anger, but in clarity, and that I hoped my son would, in time, understand them. I sealed it and gave 1 copy to the lawyer and kept 1 in my fireproof box. Then I waited. I did not tell Nathan any of this. I did not raise my voice or send a letter or call a family meeting. I went to his house the following Sunday for dinner, and I brought a casserole and I sat at the table. And this time, I sat at the table with everything. The pork tenderloin was on the table for everyone, and I watched my grandchildren eat, and I was pleasant and present, and I felt, for the first time in 2 years, entirely myself. 2 weeks later, Nathan called about the property taxes again. I said no, not elaborately, not with a speech. I said, "Nathan, I'm not able to help with that." Another pause. Longer this time. "Is everything okay, Mom?" "Yes," I said. "Everything is fine. I'm just not able to help with that." After we hung up, I went for a walk. It was the first week of November, cold but clear, and the leaves were all down and the sky was enormous, the way it gets in Ontario once the trees go bare. I walked to the end of my street and back, twice, and I thought about my mother and about the women of her generation who kept quiet about everything and died with things unsaid, and I thought about the $41,000 on my yellow legal pad, and I thought, I am 68 years old. I do not have unlimited time, and I am not going to spend what I have left being managed. He called again 3 days later. This time he asked if he could come over. I said of course. He arrived on a Thursday evening without Fiona, which surprised me. He sat at the kitchen table where Nathan had done homework as a boy, and he looked, honestly, tired. Not angry. Tired. He said they were behind on several things. The property taxes, yes, but also the line of credit on the Innisfil house, and some credit card debt that had accumulated. He laid it out more plainly than he ever had before. I think he expected me to reach for my checkbook. I made tea instead. I sat down and I looked at my son and I said, "How much do you make, Nathan?" He told me. It was a good salary, more than I had ever earned. "Then why," I said gently, "are you behind on your property taxes?" He didn't have an answer. Not a real one. He said something about the cost of living, which is true. It is high, but it was not the whole truth, and we both knew it. I told him what I had spent, not accusingly. I read the number from the legal pad, which I had kept. I watched his face change. He said, "Mom, I didn't realize." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." We sat there for a while. I told him that I loved him. I told him that I was not angry, not exactly, but that I had been invisible in a way that had taken me too long to name, and that I was not available to be a financial resource anymore. I told him about the accounts, not all the details, but enough. He needed to know that there was nothing left to count on, because counting on it had been the problem. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What about the kids?" And that, I realized, was the right question. Not what about me, not what about the taxes, what about the kids? "The children are protected," I said. "They will always be protected. That's different." He nodded slowly. I don't know what he was thinking. I don't know what he was thinking. I don't know what he went home and said to Fiona, or how that conversation went. And I realized, sitting there, that it wasn't mine to manage. I had done what I could. I had raised him. I had loved him through his father's death and his marriage and the births of his children. I had given $41,000 I could not get back. What I could do now was refuse to give more. He called me 2 weeks later and apologized. It was a real apology, or it felt like one. The kind where the person isn't asking for anything at the end of it, just saying the words because they mean them. He said he had made an appointment with a financial counselor through his employee assistance program. He said Fiona and he had had a hard conversation. He did not say what it was about. I said I was glad to hear it. And I was. I am. But I also know, and I think this is the part that nobody tells you, the part that comes after the resolution, that love and clarity can coexist, that you can love your son completely and still look plainly at what has happened between you. That forgiveness doesn't require going back to a version of things that hurt you. Lily came for butter tarts again last week. She sat on the counter and we talked about a book she was reading, and she asked me if I was happy. I thought about it, genuinely. Yes, I said. I think I am. She nodded, very seriously, the way she does. Good, she said. You should be. I put the tarts in the oven and we waited for them together, listening to the timer count down, and outside the kitchen window, the first snow of the season was just starting to fall, thin and quiet, covering the yard in white. I've thought a lot about what I would tell a younger version of myself, if I could. Not advice exactly, more like an honest account of what I learned, the slow way. The hardest part wasn't the $41,000. It wasn't even the leftovers. It was realizing that I had participated in my own invisibility, not because I was weak, but because I confused generosity with love and compliance with kindness, and keeping the peace with keeping the family together. Those are not the same things, and I spent a long time pretending they were. What I understand now is that every time I transferred money without a conversation, every time I absorbed an indignity at that Sunday dinner table and said nothing, every time I answered Nathan's calls with yes before I knew what the question was, I was teaching people how to treat me. Not intentionally, but the lesson landed anyway. That's not blame. It's just cause and effect. You show people what you'll accept, and they accept it too. And over time, it becomes the arrangement. It becomes ordinary. And ordinary is the most dangerous thing of all, because nobody questions ordinary. What broke the arrangement wasn't anger. It was clarity. Sitting at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, adding up what I had given over 18 months, that wasn't a dramatic moment. It was just arithmetic. But arithmetic, done honestly, tells the truth in a way that feelings sometimes can't. Lily asked me once if I was happy. She was 11 years old, and she asked me that with the complete seriousness that children sometimes have, the kind that stops you. I told her yes, but the truth is that when she asked, I was still working toward it. Happiness wasn't something I woke up to that November morning after I came home from the credit union. It came later, gradually, as I made decisions that were mine, that reflected what I actually valued, that I could live with when I sat alone in the evenings with my tea. I think that's what people mean when they talk about self-respect. Not a feeling. A series of choices made repeatedly that add up to a life you recognize as your own. Nathan is still my son. I love him the same as I always have. But love doesn't require me to fund a lifestyle I can't afford, or to sit quietly while I'm handed leftovers, or to be available at all hours as a solution to problems that aren't mine to solve. Those things aren't love. They're a pattern, and patterns can be changed. What I carry forward is the relationship with my grandchildren, Lily on the kitchen counter rolling dough, the butter tarts going into the oven, the first snow falling outside the window while we waited. That is the part of my life that costs nothing and means everything. I think the mistake a lot of us make, especially women of my generation, is believing that our value to the people we love is measured in what we give. That to stop giving is to stop mattering. But I am still here. I still matter to Lily. And I matter to myself now in a way I hadn't for years. That, in the end, is what changed. Not Nathan's behavior, not the finances, not even the accounts. What changed was that I stopped waiting for someone else to decide I deserved better and decided it for myself. It was a quiet decision, made at a kitchen table in the morning with a cup of tea going cold beside me. Nobody saw it happen, but I did.